Welcome to Knock Talk. I am your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of Rabbi Cross Examines the New Testament. This week, Ephesians chapter 3 with Rabbi Michael Skobac from Canada. Welcome, sir. Good to have you back.
How you doing there?
I'm doing good, sweet Rabbi. I'm glad you're back here. Glad to get this thing going, and glad I found my music knob. It was driving me nuts there for a second. No matter how, I don't know. I think me not being like over the weather, I'm going to say it that way, my brain is like confused on what knobs to push and buttons to push. But then again, somebody say, well, you're always like that, William. I'm like, well, in that case, it's not the problem.
So I wouldn't quite say that.
Right, there you go. Very good. So Ephesians chapter 3, and you've got just a grand slam of a title that you've given us for today. I think it's very clever for sure. Because there's so much truth in all the titles. I mean, did Jesus really bring reconciliation to the world or the gospel message at all? And so we're finding out more and more just what our opinions are. So there we go. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Rabbi, and I'll follow you along as best I can.
Okay. So this chapter really sort of follows on the heel of the previous chapter where Paul actually began to develop this idea that one of the results coming of the Paul was concerned was to bring about essentially what he refers to as one new man, that basically all human beings, be they Jew or Gentile, once they come to faith in Jesus, Paul claims that they now are all equal heirs to the same kingdom. Essentially, as we're going to see later on in Paul's writings, there's no longer Jew, no longer Gentile, but they're all one in the church. And he's going to continue along the same lines in this chapter. But he sort of he backs up a little bit to do the same thing he's done numerous times in the past. In verses 1, 2, 7, and 8, Paul begins to recapitulate his credentials. And in John MacArthur's commentary to this chapter, he writes that Paul was compelled, it's a strong word, Paul was compelled to affirm his authority. Because apparently, as far as John MacArthur is concerned, Paul's going to be breaking new ground in the development of this idea of one new man. And in order to give credibility to his teaching, Paul is compelled to basically validate his authority, meaning under whose say-so is Paul issuing these teachings. So here in the very beginning, in verses 1 and 2, Paul says that he is on behalf of the Gentiles. He's speaking here to a Gentile church, essentially. And he speaks in verse 2, he says that the stewardship of God's grace that was given to me, it was given to me for you, Paul says, meaning that he was basically given this assignment to be the apostle to the Gentiles, but it wasn't something Paul is saying that he grabbed. It wasn't something that he assumed. It was something that was given to him. And then if we go a little bit further in the chapter to verse 7, Paul says, of this gospel I was made a minister according to the gift of God's grace, which was given to me. So again, Paul repeats this idea that his authority comes from God's grace that was given to him. And in verse 8, he sort of again emphasizes that this grace was given for Paul to minister to the Gentiles. So this is something that, again, we've seen numerous times in the past, and Paul again goes back and repeats this here in this chapter, essentially claiming that his role as a teacher and an apostle and someone who's going to be revealing new truths, this is something that he has on authority from God. And again, our question is simply, where's the evidence? meaning this is a very self-serving assertion. For someone to say that I have my authority on the word of God. Well, if God really did give someone authority, that's a pretty strong claim. But the question is, how are we to know that that's the case? Meaning, how would anyone be able to validate or corroborate Paul's claim? And again, it's not possible. Paul is just basically making a very bold claim that this is something that he was appointed to by God. And that's all we really have is his claim, his assertion. There's a famous story, I might have mentioned this in the past, of a great rabbi who had a big following, and he passed away without ever really clarifying who was supposed to take over his leadership. He had two sons, and after his death, the two sons would constantly make arguments to put forward their own leadership. Each son claimed that they were more qualified, that that their father would have wanted them to take over. But the father never left anything in writing, never spoke to anyone. He just left the world, and you have now these two sons that are fighting it out. And one day, one of the sons comes before the entire group and says to his brother, well, listen, Father made it clear last night that I am supposed to be the next leader because Father appeared to me in a dream and told me that I'm going to be the next leader. And his brother looked at him and said, well, that's very convenient. But if our Father really wanted to make it clear that you were supposed to be the next leader, he would have appeared to me in a dream. Right. And told me that you're supposed to be the next leader. I had a good friend who was a Jew who unfortunately converted to Christianity. He became part of a Messianic congregation, and one of the women there had her eye on him. And she came up to him one day and said, the Lord revealed to me that we're supposed to be married. And my friend was not at all interested in her, and was quite taken aback by this, because if God is insisting that he marry this person, what's he supposed to do? Right. So he went to the pastor, who wisely said to him, listen, when the Lord reveals this to you, then we'll talk. But at this point, it's just something that she's claiming. Right. So again, that's all we really have from Paul, is Paul's assertion that God appointed him. And what's interesting is that the other apostles, again, the ones that are indisputable because they actually were students of Jesus and were by the side of Jesus, and Jesus appointed them. There are apostles about whom there's no question that they were given assignments. And these people don't seem to have simply accepted Paul's claim that Jesus appointed him to be the apostle to the Gentiles, because in the book of Acts, chapter 15, when really the first serious issue comes up in the early church, the first issue about which they really had to make a decision, that was the question of what happens to all of the Gentiles that are coming to faith in Jesus as a result of Paul's ministry. And, the question was, some people suggested that if Gentiles wanted to follow Jesus, they have to basically get converted, get circumcised, observe all the commandments of the Torah. And Paul was insisting, no, they don't have to do any of that. And so this was a huge debate. Now, again, had the other apostles accepted Paul's claim that he was given the assignment by Jesus himself to be the official apostle to the Gentiles, then they should have turned to Paul at that point, and they should have said to Paul, well, what are we supposed to, what do you say? Meaning that we're assuming that Jesus is is giving you revelation, and you're the one that should speak up and basically make the decision. But they didn't do that. They really said that this will be decided by James. James was the official leader of the Jesus movement in Jerusalem, and James decided the issue. They didn't look to Paul for guidance. So it's not so clear that the other apostles simply accepted Paul's claim that he was an apostle because Jesus appointed him as such. Now, what's interesting is that Paul speaks about this idea that the Gentiles will become equal heirs with the Jewish people as God's people, meaning believing Gentiles who come to faith in Jesus will now become equal heirs to God's kingdom, God's people. Paul refers to this as a mystery. And again, a mystery is something that is not mysterious now. It's a mystery because previously it had never been articulated, never been explained or taught clearly, but now Paul is saying it is being revealed. Paul is revealing this idea. And Paul refers to it in verse 4 as my insight. He says, when you read this, you can perceive my insight into the mystery of the Messiah. Now, it's interesting that in verse 4, he refers to it as my insight, but in verse 3, he says that this was made known to him through revelation. So which is it? Is it my insight, something that he has basically taught on his own, or is it something that was revealed to him? And you're really getting a mixed message here from Paul, where in one verse he speaks about it as something that was revealed to him, and in the very next verse he refers to it as my revelation. Now, it would seem, at least it would seem to me, that if this was something that was accomplished, this unification of Jew and Gentile, if this was accomplished with the advent of Jesus, then why didn't Jesus ever teach this? We would think that this seems to be in the writings of Paul a very significant idea, a very significant reality that takes place with the advent of Jesus. And I would wonder, why didn't Jesus ever teach this idea? Why something that only Paul reveals after the death of Jesus? It's very clear that during the ministry of Jesus, he clearly differentiated and distinguished between Jews and Gentiles. Jesus would constantly say that he's only come for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He tells his apostles in the beginning of the book of Matthew not to go to the cities of the Gentiles, not to go to the cities of the Samaritans, but to only preach his words to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, to Jews. And it's not really until after the alleged resurrection of Jesus that the Gospels have Jesus saying in Matthew 28 that now there's a great commission to take the good news to the Gentiles as well, to all the nations of the world. But even there, Jesus never goes so far as to say that this distinction between Jews and Gentiles is broken down, and now basically Gentiles and Jews are really all homogenized into one new group, a sort of a new entity called the church, where they're sort of completely on equal footing, and there's no distinction between Jews and Gentiles, or you could call them in the eyes of the church former Gentiles, or at least former pagans. But this is something which we don't find in the teachings of Jesus at all. And I'm simply wondering why that's the case, why it really isn't revealed until Paul. And Paul calls it my revelation, my insight. So this is, to me, has a little bit of a question mark on top of it. Now, in verse 5, Paul refers to this as a mystery that was not known in previous generations. This idea that one day the Jews and the Gentiles would become homogenized into one new kind of being. Now, the Reformation Study Bible says that the idea of sort of the one new man, the idea that there'd be a complete unification of Jews and Gentiles as equal heirs, could not have been totally absent from the Old Testament. This is a comment by the Reformation Study Bible. They say that, here Paul is saying that this is a mystery that was not known at all in previous generations, but the Reformation Study Bible says not really. They insist that the idea could not have been totally absent from the Old Testament. Otherwise, they say, Paul could not have thought, or could not have taught, I'm sorry. Paul could not have taught as he did in Romans chapter 4, and again, as he teaches here as well, that the Abrahamic covenant included all who were of a like faith with Abraham, including Gentiles. Meaning Paul seems to say, going back already to Romans chapter 4, that the covenant that God made with Abraham, that he's going to be the father of a special people, includes not only the physical heirs of Abraham, but anyone who has faith, like Abraham had faith. And the Reformation Study Bible says that the reason that it had to be sourced, meaning the reason that this idea of one new man, of sort of a conglomeration of Jew and Gentile united together as one new kind of entity, the reason it had to be sourced, the reason there had to be some preamble or some hinting at this idea in the Old Testament, was that Paul told Agrippus in Acts chapter 26, verses 22 to 23, he told Agrippus that the proclamation of light to both Jew and Gentile does not go beyond what had been promised by Moses and the prophets. So Paul there, back in Acts, says that the teachings of light, the light that comes as a result of the Messiah, he's saying that they could not be effects that were not already revealed through Moses and the prophets. There had to be some prior indication in the Torah, the books of Moses, or the books of the prophets, that this idea of one new man was indeed going to take place. This is what, again, the Reformation Study Bible insists, that it's an idea that had to be already hinted at, or at least sort of taught in some way already in the Hebrew Bible. Now, the problem is with this idea that if these were already real promises, meaning if we already had in the Hebrew Bible a clear teaching that one day there would be a total unification of Jews and Gentiles who believe in the Messiah as one new being called the church, and they're equal heirs, and as Paul would say, that middle wall of hostility was broken down. If that's the case, and it was already taught by the prophets in the Hebrew Bible, then it's not really a mystery. Paul seems to indicate that it's a mystery that was not previously taught and is only now being revealed by him. So we have a little bit of a problem here, because, again, the Reformation Study Bible insists that it had to be something that was already at least there in the Hebrew Bible. Otherwise, Paul really would be contradicting himself, because in Acts, he seems to say that the light of the Messiah will not reveal anything that hasn't already been spoken about by Moses or the prophets. And so the problem is, as we're going to see, that some of the Christian commentaries try to find sources in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, for this one new man theology. But again, if it's there in the Tanakh, then it wouldn't be a mystery, as Paul claims it is. And if there was really no such promise, meaning if it's not really in the Hebrew Bible, if it's not really something which was ever taught by the prophets in the Hebrew Bible, then Paul sort of is in trouble in terms of the promise he made back in Acts 26. So what are these hints? Where do you see in the Hebrew Bible hints that there's going to be essentially an amalgamation of Jews and Gentiles in the days of the Messiah? So many of the commentaries, many of the Christian commentaries point to Isaiah chapter 49, verse 6. And there it says the following: Hashem said, "It was insufficient that you be a servant for me only to raise up the tribes of Jacob and restore the ruins of Israel. I will make you a light for the nations, so that my salvation may extend to the ends of the earth." So it's not so clear, by the way, how to read this passage, because it's not clear if this is referring to Isaiah, who's going to be a light to the nations, or it's referring to the righteous among the people of Israel, who will be a light to the nations. The commentaries really have a number of ways of approaching this. But if we try to understand this passage in Isaiah in a way that would be helpful to Paul, it doesn't say what Paul is saying. It simply speaks about the light of the Jewish people, or the light of the teachings of Isaiah, reaching the ends of the earth. And this is not an unusual teaching. You know, the Hebrew Bible has predicted numerous times that the nation of Israel is going to bless and be a blessing to the rest of the world, and be witnesses of God, to really reveal to the nations of the world about God. And so one of the main prophecies in the Hebrew Bible about the coming of the Messiah is that in the times of the Messiah, all the nations of the world would believe in God, would know God. This is one of the reasons why we know the Messiah has not yet come, because we don't live in a world yet where there's universal knowledge of God. But these passages which speak about the nations of the world coming to faith in God don't say anything about the nations of the world becoming amalgamated with the people of Israel, and there being no further or no eternal distinctions between the people of Israel and the nations of the world. It's very clear. I mean, it's one of the clearest things in the Bible that God promises Israel that they would be a special nation forever, and their distinctiveness would be forever. They would never lose that distinctiveness, as the prophet Jeremiah says, as long as there are stars and heavenly bodies like the sun and the moon, Israel will be a special nation. So this is obviously not really a useful source for Paul's teaching of his mystery, that there's going to be a total amalgamation of Jew and Gentile, such that the distinctions between them will be broken down in the times of the Messiah, and it's going to be one new man. There's no such teaching at all in the Hebrew Bible, and it doesn't say this in Isaiah 49:6. It is taught that the teachings of the Torah, that the teachings of Israel, that the influence of Israel, who are supposed to be a nation of priests and a holy nation, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, we are supposed to influence the rest of the world. We're supposed to teach the rest of the world. As Isaiah says in chapter 60, all the nations, God promises, will come to your light. But it doesn't say that they will then dissolve themselves among you, and there'll be no more distinction between Jews and non-Jews. Another source for this idea, this is a source that's cited by the Reformation Study Bible, is Isaiah chapter 19, verse 25. Now, you have to really read a few more verses than just verse 25 to get an understanding of that passage. So we'll go back to verse 23, where Isaiah prophesies. This is in chapter, again, 19, verse 23. On that day there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, Assyrians will come to Egypt and Egyptians to Assyria, and Egypt and Assyria will serve God. Well, again, this is in line with what we mentioned before, that the nations of the world will come to serve God. This, again, is not rocket science. This is something which the Bible teaches numerous times. And then Isaiah goes on to say, on that day, Israel will be a third partner with Egypt and Assyria for blessing on earth, for the Lord of hosts will bless them, saying, blessed is my people, Egypt, the work of my hands, Assyria, and my inheritance, Israel. So only Israel is described as God's inheritance, not the other nations of the world. And then there's another source that I found. It's sort of a little bit more difficult to track down, but in the book of Acts, chapter 15, verses 13 to 18, Paul seems to reference the prophet Amos, chapter 9, verses 11 and 12, to again make this point that the distinction between Jew and Gentile will be broken down with the advent of the Messiah. And so there, what does the prophet Amos say? So again, this is chapter 9, verses 11 and 12. On that day, I will erect David's fallen booth. This is apparently referring to the rebuilding of the temple. This is the third temple that will be erected in the times of the Messiah. I will mend its breaches, erect its ruins, and rebuild it as in the days of old. So that we're going to have basically the renewal of our holy temple in Jerusalem. And then in verse 12 it says, so that those who are called by my name, and we know who is called by name. The Bible constantly says that it's Israel who are called by God's name. So in verse 12, so that those who are called by my name will inherit the remnant of Edom and all the other nations, declares God, who will do these things. Now, I think that the reason that the book of Acts finds this verse to be helpful to Paul's theology is that they translate this verse in Amos differently and give the impression that it's speaking about the nations of the world inheriting the same thing that Israel inherits, but it's really not an accurate translation of the verse. So there really, again, when we read the entire Hebrew scriptures, we don't really find any indication of Paul's new man where there's going to be essentially a dissolving of the distinctions between Israel and the nations, and that there'll be the nations, the Gentiles, will be equal heirs with Israel as God's special people. That special role of Israel in the Hebrew Bible is basically something which is maintained forever, eternally. One last issue which I wanted to focus on now, which is really the title of the program we gave for tonight, when it says in verse 6 that Gentiles are fellow heirs, that this is again Paul's vision of the mystery. Gentiles become fellow heirs with Israel. So the Reformation Study Bible says as follows: Jesus took away the divisions that fractured humanity. Right? Once we say that Gentiles become fellow heirs with the Jews, so again, this, according to the Reformation Study Bible, is a doing away with the divisions between different nations, between Israel and the nations of the world that fractured humanity. This again is what Paul referred to back in chapter 2 of Ephesians as the dividing wall of hostility. We saw last time we studied together that Paul really spoke about the Torah itself, the laws, as a dividing wall of hostility. But he uses this image that there is this wall of hostility that divides, separates between Jews and Gentiles. And Paul's mystery is that with the coming of the Messiah, that wall, that separation, is broken down. And the Reformation Study Bible goes even further. They say that for Paul, there is no deeper division in the human race than that between Jew and Gentile, that they could be united with each other in the Messiah proves that Jesus is the Lord of the universe. This again is the comment by the Reformation Study Bible. Now, this is again is a claim that I'd like just to think about as we come to a close tonight. The claim is here that with the advent of Jesus as the Messiah, this wall of hostility between Jew and Gentile has been broken down, and that we now have reconciliation between Jew and Gentile. Now, I would say that this is an incredibly ironic thing to say in light of the 2,000 years of Christian anti-Judaism that we've seen. Clearly, not all Christians have been anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish, but we can't deny the fact that for 2,000 years, there's been an incredible amount of hatred and persecution and worse directed toward Jews, specifically by people identifying as Christians. This may not be a typical example, but it's one of the most recent ones. I think many of you have probably heard of this. There was a broadcast recently which became, I think it became quite notorious, by a Reverend Wiles. He has internet, I guess it's an internet television program. I'm not sure if it appears on cable television, but he's a Christian pastor, so he's not some kook that's running around the street just speaking on his own. He's got a staff and a crew and a board of directors, and he has viewers. And recently he went on this incredibly anti-Jewish rant that was frightening. I'm not going to read the entire rant, just a few of the lines where he says to his audience, "They, the Jews, are coming for you. There's going to be a purge. That's the next thing that happens when Jews take over a country. They kill millions of Christians." That's quite amazing.
Wow.
I mean, I don't remember the last time in history when that ever happened, that Jews took over a country and killed millions of Christians. I do remember times when it was on the opposite foot,
right,
meaning that millions of Jews have been murdered by Christians. But he says this unabashedly, that Christians better be careful, because that's what happens when Jews take over a country. They kill millions of Christians. And he says that's the way Jews work. He speaks about them as lying. They're deceivers. They plot. They lie. They do whatever they have to do to accomplish their political agenda. And then he went on to say, I'm not going to go again through the whole disgusting rant, but again, this is coming from a Christian that has a following. He compared Jews to animals and carriers of disease, which again was something that the Nazis did. And this is just, if you want to say, the latest example of Jew hatred coming from, again, an identifying Christian, someone who considers himself to be a follower of Jesus, a religious Christian. I don't think, thank God, he's typical of Christians, but to say that with the advent of Jesus, this hostility between Jew and Gentile has been basically torn down and there's reconciliation is absurd, because it's really
right,
incredible that we have, since the advent of Jesus, quite the opposite. We have in Christianity a catalyst for incredible hostility towards Jews and against Jews. I mean, it's something that we're going to point out in some of the books we're going to be studying in the coming months and years. There's plenty of hostility to Jews right on the pages of the Christian Bible itself. And I have a YouTube video. It's a long lecture that basically chronicles, it outlines 2,000 years of Christian hatred and persecution of Jews. And there have been many books written on this topic by Christians. Many honest Christians are willing to own up to the fact that this is an ugly stain on the church. But again, it's impossible for me to take this claim seriously,
Right.
that this sort of hostility, this wall of hostility has been broken down with the advent of Jesus, that's obviously something which has not happened. And what's interesting is, aside from Christian haters of Jews and Judaism, there's plenty of non-Christian hatred of Jews and Judaism. Meaning that what Paul is saying here is that there's been a breaking down of hostility between Jews and Gentiles. So obviously, this has not been the case. There are plenty of Gentiles who are not Christian that hate Jews. We don't have to look too far. And certainly there are many Gentiles who are Christians that hate Jews and have persecuted Jews. Now, what Christian apologists would say is, well, that's the case among non-Christian Gentiles. They do hate Jews, and non-Christian and Christians who are not really Christians, meaning Christians who don't really believe in Jesus, they may really hate Jews. So there's an attempt to, sort of step this back and say, well, but certainly among people who are sincere Christians and real Christians, that hostility between Jews and Gentiles will be broken down. And that very well might be the case. I mean, I tend to see that being the case, that people who are sincere, God-fearing Christians tend to not hate Jews. The problem is that we could have the same reconciliation if all of those Christians converted to Judaism. Meaning, if all Paul is saying here is that there's going to be a reconciliation between Jews who embrace Jesus and Gentiles who embrace Jesus, well, I'm not surprised, because they've all become co-religionists. These are Jews that for the past 2,000 years essentially checked out of the camp of Judaism and have essentially checked into the camp of Christianity. And if all Paul is saying is that what the advent of Jesus did was to bring reconciliation between Jews who've embraced Jesus and Gentiles who've embraced Jesus, that to me is no great accomplishment, because again, we could have easily had the same kind of reconciliation between all religious Jews and all Christians who converted to Judaism. But one of the problems with this Christian, sort of spin here is that it's no great accomplishment, meaning that, for the vast majority of the world who are not Christian, or who are in the eyes of, the Christian minority who do like Jews and who do get along with Jews, we're talking about the greater Gentile world and much of the Christian world who still have hostility to Jews. So there really was no great accomplishment with the advent of Jesus, meaning that it was a minority over the course of 2,000 years, a small minority of followers of Jesus who did get reconciled to Jews, and to that degree, really mainly only to Jews who converted to Christianity. But the truth is that this form of replacement theology essentially did away with 99% of the Jews, meaning that, and we discussed this in chapter 2 of Ephesians, that Paul's vision of one new man basically says that God's people now, God's people, his special people, are no longer corporate Israel. It's basically Jews who've come to faith in Jesus and Gentiles who've come to faith in Jesus. And for practically speaking, that eliminates over 99% of the Jews in the world. So the only way that this great accomplishment takes place is by essentially doing away with virtually all Jews. And really all Paul is left with here is this group of Christians, that includes a sprinkling of Jews over history, and he maintains that this hostility has been broken down. Of course, I'm not even going to get into tonight, just a cursory study of church history, meaning that the hostility among Christians themselves, Gentile Christians themselves, has been incredible over the past 2,000 years. I mean, anyone that studies, European history will see the numerous wars that took place between different branches, different denominations, different movements within Christianity. So it hasn't only been a bloody and hateful history of Christians versus Jews, but among Christians themselves. I grew up with an incredible conflict in Northern Ireland between Protestants and Catholics, but you don't need to go, you don't need to be so recent. Going back to, a significant amount of church history, it's impossible to characterize it as love and peace and all smiles and everyone getting along. There's been incredible rancor and acrimony and hostility and violence. Certainly, among the different groups within Christianity, religion has been a contact sport. And so I think that this claim of reconciliation and everyone is basically one new man and lovey-dovey, it just, again, hype. It's the kind of hype that we have not seen manifested in reality, facts on the ground. And I think those facts on the ground are important. As I've taught many times, when the Hebrew Bible speaks about the Messianic age, it's all empirically verifiable. It is all realities that have to be verifiable by observation. And then you know that it's real. And here we see, a major claim made in the Christian Bible for one of the benefits of the advent of Christianity that simply is just a fantasy, because it really has not been this way. We have not seen the middle wall of partition, of hostility broken down. We have not seen reconciliation. It's something that the Hebrew Bible prophesies, that the Messiah will come and there will be peace in the world. But again, to me, this is further proof that we have not yet seen the coming of the Messiah because of all the hostility that still exists in the world. So that's more or less what I had to share on chapter 3 in Ephesians.
Okay.
And I'm sorry for my sort of ranting there.
No, that's quite all right. We always learn something.
I had to meet Paul's rant with my rant.
It's okay. It's okay. Title very well fitting for sure. So, all right. Well, thank you, Rabbi, for delivering a good Ephesians chapter 3. So next week, join us for chapter 4. How many chapters are we in? 6? I don't even know.
I think there's 6 in Ephesians, if I'm not mistaken.
Gotcha. Very good. All right. So that's what we'll do. So I hope you guys have a great week. And Rabbi, I hope you have a wonderful week. And you should be well. And we'll see you later on the other side. Shalom, shalom. And you have a Shavua Tov. Take care. Bye.
You should feel well as well.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה